And so now comes the dangerous and more contentious part of this unit, where we're no longer just talking about the change of how people communicate through the media, but also the change in the effect that the media has on people, or the influence that both the media and the audience have, and the debate that surrounds the media's power in our society. While the exact nature of the relationship between media and audiences is debated, one thing that is mostly agreed on is that things have changed in the post-broadcast media landscape. In a previous video, I've highlighted that idea of Web 2.0 being a key moment in time where the media has changed significantly, but that it has continued to evolve and will continue to evolve as change is inevitable in the media landscape. And whenever there is change in any aspect, there comes fear. An increase in audience agency, a globalized media, and changes to how media institutions make money has resulted in a number of legal and ethical issues in more recent times. But we understand that as new players enter the media landscape, perhaps they disrupt or dismantle old players. And people who are involved in the media find this threatening, whether they are media institutions themselves, audience members, or governments. An example of this fear can be found in almost any time there is a new craze in the media that hits, and usually because it's new, it is picked up by kids and teenagers, and because it's different, it has a backlash from parents and schools and other established institutions. A couple of years ago, we found this happening in reaction to Fortnite, and people were believing that violent video games like Fortnite increased aggression and a lack of empathy in kids. And of course, this sparked a fair bit of outrage.
So what's the aim of the game?
To kill all the other players in the game.
Correct. So how does that compare, Sandy, to a game of footy with your mates?
Look, there's unequivocal research about the impact of these sorts of games. There's over 130 evidence-based pieces of research that tell us that violent games like this increase aggressiveness, increase angry thoughts, increase aggressive behaviour. So we can either choose to dismiss this sort of research or take it on board as parents and say, this is what the scientific community is telling us, that this is really something that we need to be very mindful of, and we really need to guard our children's brains.
And while there is research that does point to a link between violence or aggressive thoughts and playing video games, this type of research isn't new. Famously, in the 1950s and 60s, Albert Bandura conducted what is called the Bobo doll experiment, where children were shown video clips of adults playing aggressively with one of these inflatable clown Bobo dolls. And he found that there was a link in the children who watched these violent clips and the way that they would aggressively play with the doll afterwards. And so at the time, of course, there developed an outrage against the influence of television in terms of making kids violent and aggressive. And so we can see that this outrage and debate about the influence of the media tends to occur whenever a new media form is released, whether that is television in the 1950s or Fortnite in the 2010s. And so we really need to ask ourselves, as critical evaluators of the media, are the children of today more at risk at being influenced by violence in the media than previous generations? Or is that outrage against Fortnite's violence as futile as the outrage against the violence of Looney Tunes cartoons in the 50s? In a similar way, a couple of years ago, there was a significant amount of outrage against the Netflix series 13 Reasons Why, where in Canada, schools were banned from any discussion of the series because of its depiction of suicide. And there was much discussion, even at our own school, about the risk of students being influenced by suicidal thoughts from watching this series. Again, we can look back at a Disney cartoon in 1947, where here Daisy Duck is considering suicide because her boyfriend at the time, Donald Duck, was rejecting her. So again, this debate about the influence of the media over particularly children and teenagers, is it something new? Is it something to be worried about, considering the generations of the past have gotten through it pretty unscathed? Another contentious point in terms of the media is that various theorists, academics, and commentators have come up with plenty of suggestions and studies around the effect of the media on audiences. And it's a debate as old as the media itself, and yet the one thing that constantly comes up is that there is no agreement, where we can have studies that publish evidence of violent video games making children more violent, and then other studies publishing equally compelling evidence to suggest that there is in fact no link between violent video games and audience or children's behavior. So where does that leave us here as media analysts, media evaluators? Well, the key thing that we need to understand is that there are many studies about the effects or the influence of the media, but there is no proof. There is absolutely no agreement on what the influence of the media on audiences is, as well as there is no agreement on what the influence of audience is on the media. So then why are we studying this thing in the first place, if there's absolutely no proof, if there is no answer? Well, when it comes to determining the nature of agency and control, it's really important for us to avoid generalizations and to be understanding of the intricacies of this debate. As there's no definitive answers to the questions that this study poses, we need to constantly ask ourselves the following questions when we are engaging and attempting to understand a particular media product. How was the relationship between the media and the audience once explained? And then in a contemporary media landscape, what elements of these particular theories and studies work in today's environment? And so this will segue us into theories of the influence around media and audience. And there are dozens, literally dozens of theories of media communication over the last 100 years. Each go towards somewhat explaining the nature of media influence. And in VCE media, for us, we're going to look at two: the agenda setting function theory and spreadable media theory. However, if we think about all of the theories that exist and half a dozen of them sort of selected at random, we can see in the spectrum of the media has total control to the media has no control over audiences, we can actually see how these theories all spread out. And again, there is no consensus here. One theory has very compelling arguments, and then the other one on the opposite end of the spectrum might have equally compelling arguments. So we're going to look at a couple and compare them and try to apply them to some examples in order to attempt to understand some of these theories' benefits as well as their weaknesses. But that will come in a subsequent video.